1968 was one of the most tumultuous years in modern history. Headline after headline of unthinkable news filled television screens and newspaper front pages. Korean hostage crisis, Soviet takeover of Czechoslovakia, the Tet Offensive, the tragic My Lai massacre, and the horrors of the Vietnam War. Civil rights protests, anti-war demonstrations, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago devolving into violence, the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. It was hard to catch a breath surrounded by such pain and heartache. Enter Christmas Eve. 3 men sit in a command module orbiting the moon as a part of the Apollo 8 mission, a critical precursor to the following year's Apollo 11. Into the homes of tens of millions of viewers came these familiar words from their television broadcast.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on this good earth.
Consider the meaning of this moment. On the ground, it felt like the world was in a tailspin. But from above, these 3 men knew the real story. The same God from Genesis who fashioned our world was still there, holding it all together. Perspective. At moments, pain feels all-consuming. It can cause us to believe that everything we know is tumbling out of control. It is in these dark moments that we are given the choice to look up and consider the reality of God in the midst of our pain. He created the world. He authored life. He's not shaken by the hysteria so often encountered in the world around us. He has the power to resurrect the dead things in our stories. And even if he doesn't, and our pain persists, we can still know that he's there, holding our world in his hands, looking upon us with loving eyes.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. So if you don't know me, my name's Curtis. I think I know everyone here, though. Maybe not, I don't know. It's hard to see. Anyway, today is the 7th and final message of this series, Last Supper on the Moon. And if this is the first week you've joined us, then, or if you just haven't been paying attention, we're going through the 7 signs found in John chapters 2 through 11. And I want to start by giving just a very brief recap. The 7 signs, they're going to be up here on the screen. They are Jesus turning water into wine. They should be on the screen. There we go. Jesus turning water into wine in chapter 2, and then healing a royal official's son, healing a disabled man, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, healing a man born blind, and then raising Lazarus from the dead. Today, we're going to be talking about the last one, raising Lazarus from the dead. But some information on these. These 7 signs, they take up the first half of John's gospel. In my research this week, I didn't know this, but these are often called the book of signs, since it recounts the 7 signs or miracles that Jesus performs. And these signs are called these miracles are called signs because they not only demonstrate Jesus' power, but they also tell us something about who Jesus is. And the main point of the miracles is to provoke faith in Jesus. And the signs are often linked in some way to Jesus' teaching. So like, for example, Jesus feeds the 5,000 with loaves and fish, and then he teaches that he is the true manna from heaven, the bread of life. So they're saying something about him. The 7th sign raising Lazarus from the dead in chapter 11, that's what we're going to talk about today, this sign has two important functions. First, I got to slow down. I know Pat is like, Curtis, slow down. The seventh, okay, so two important functions. Two. First, this is the event that, it was the hay that broke the camel's back. Is that the saying, or is it straw? The straw that broke the camel's back. It provokes the religious leaders to act against Jesus. This is like, they recognize that if we let him go on like this, then everyone's going to believe in him. So they decided that they need to get rid of him. And second, this miracle serves as a preview and foreshadowing of the greatest sign of all, the resurrection of Jesus. So functions as the event that caused Jesus to go to his crucifixion, and then it also functions as the ultimate foretelling of the resurrection of Jesus. Before raising Lazarus, Jesus tells Martha that I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. Jesus' own resurrection would provide life to all who believe. And that's kind of the main point of this story. But what I want to do today is look at some of the emotions in this story and ask some questions. One of which, what are we supposed to do when God lets us down? And you might be thinking, God doesn't let us down. We sing the song, "You're never going to let me down." You know that song? But sometimes it feels so deeply like we've been let down by God. Sometimes we physically see the resurrection, so to speak, in our stories, and sometimes we don't. And how do we deal with that? So, we're going to start by reading John 11, verses 1 through 45. So, buckle your seatbelt. Can someone please get me a bottle of water? There goes my wife. Thank you. I hate the sound. Oh. Okay, here we go. Chapter 11. It's going to be on the screen. That was really fast. Let me take a drink before we start this. Dramatic pause. Okay. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." He obviously doesn't understand what's going on. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha had heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Look at the emotions here in this section. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been in there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may also believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did and believed in him. So, if you've been following with this series, oh, you just gave away the punchline. If you've been following along with this series, Last Supper on the Moon, you know that we've been using space travel in the Apollo space program as an illustration. And today, in talking about Lazarus, we're going to talk a lot about sickness and death, all that fun stuff. It is impossible to separate death from space exploration. Space travel itself is deadly, of course, but we also weren't quite sure if there were going to be germs on the moon, and we had no way of knowing how to prevent or treat sickness from the moon when the astronauts got back to Earth. So, to be safe, the astronauts actually had to quarantine for 3 weeks before and after. In isolation, they stayed in a camper. And we were wondering, are they going to die? Are they going to infect everyone? Are they going to unleash some kind of alien virus that's going to spawn out of our chests? Does anyone get that reference? Okay. I was really curious if anyone would. So anyway, no one knew what was going to happen. Turns out there was no disease on the moon to bring home, but there were a few times when they brought disease to the moon. The most famous being on Apollo 8, which happened in the 60s, and we happened to be in the middle of a pandemic at the time. One of the astronauts on Apollo 8 was sick, and his symptoms were diarrhea and vomiting at the same time, which is not a good thing to have in zero gravity. Yeah. It's very interesting, though, how that astronaut got infected. So the president at the time was Lyndon B. Johnson. He was very sick, but he insisted on having a face-to-face meeting with the astronauts before their mission. So it could be that President Johnson actually infected the astronauts. Anyway, despite our best efforts, sickness still happens in space travel, and so does death. In fact, throughout the Apollo era, here we go, there are 7 groups of men who trained to be astronauts, 73 men in total. Of those 73, only about 40 got to fly, but in a 4-year period, 9 of those 73 astronauts died. 3 while testing the Apollo 1 capsule, and then several of them died in plane accidents. More than 10% of the astronauts died in a 4-year period. 5 of those deaths all occurred in 1967. So death was a common experience for them, and they were acquainted with funerals. Before the Apollo era, though, most of them had already been acquainted with death because they were in the Navy. Specifically, they were test pilots. This was at the height of the test pilot era. It was during Vietnam, and during that time period, 23% of pilots would die in accidents, and that does not include combat fatalities. Many of these were test pilots, And their job description was to push the envelope. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. In 1903, we get airplanes for the first time, thanks to the Wright brothers. Their first flight was 120 feet. In 1969, we flew 250,000 miles to the moon. To get from string and wood and cloth and just holding on for dear life to flying to the moon, what does that take? It takes a lot of people pushing the envelope. In the 1950s, test pilots in America were being killed at a rate of 1 per week. 1 per week. In 66 years, from the flight of the Wright brothers to landing on the moon, there was a lot of sickness and death. But eventually we made it, one of the greatest achievements in human history. And, as you know, not to be a bummer, but no one gets off of planet Earth without death. Every single one of us are going to experience death, and that is the reason Jesus came, to destroy death. And that's what the Lazarus story is pointing to, the ultimate resurrection of Jesus and his defeat of death. So, one thing we can deduce from Lazarus' story, though, is that there will be times when we feel let down. Disappointment is one of the main themes of this text. Where were you? Why didn't you stop this from happening? If only you had been there, he wouldn't have died. So, let's talk about disappointment. The Bible has a lot to say about it, and sometimes it's not very fun. We don't typically read some of these chapters in church, some of these chapters that are just all disappointment, confusion, betrayal. The book of Psalms has some of it. Psalms is usually viewed as being an uplifting, practical part of the Old Testament, and it definitely is that, but there are psalms that are also desperate, honest cries for help in the face of trouble. Some of them are just downright startling and unsettling, specifically in the way they talk about God. And I think they have a lot to tell us about the life of faith. They have a lot to say about trusting God, because they go to those personal dark places that we don't like to really expose. So, one of my favorite Bible scholars has 3 broad categories. The Bible scholar's name is Pete Enns. He has 3 broad categories for the 150 Psalms that we have in the Bible. So these are going to be on the screen, the 3 broad categories. The first one, everything is fine, God is great, stay the course. That's category 1. Okay. Category 2, things are terribly wrong, and I'm at the end of my rope. But thank you, Lord, for coming to my rescue. Alternate ending, I know that you'll come to my rescue soon or eventually. And then the third category, which is kind of where we're focusing. Things are terribly wrong, I'm at the end of my rope, and to make things worse, O Lord, you're nowhere to be found. So, we're going to read a psalm that fits into that last category, Psalm 88. And I'm going to read a summarized version of it from that same scholar, which I really like this. So here we go, Psalm 88. O Lord, it's not nearly as long as the last one, I promise. O Lord, I have been on my knees to you night after night. I am so troubled and in so much agony. I feel like I have one foot in the grave, in deep, dark places. I am absolutely without hope, including in you. You don't really seem to care. Actually, let me be blunt. You've abandoned me, so this is all your fault. You're the one who makes me feel like this. You are even the one responsible for my own friends looking at me like I'm some sort of freak show. Even so, all night and all day, I'm on my knees praying, calling to you for some relief. I'm desperate, but you keep on hiding. I'm in absolute pain, and the only friend I have is darkness. Thanks for nothing. That's how it ends. Some of you are like, why would you read that right now on Sunday morning? I think we have to be honest with ourselves. That's why I'm reading it to you this morning. Because we like to present a version that's so neat and perfect and tidy, but honestly, we all deal with moments like this. And these emotions are present in the Lazarus story. Sounds like a faith crisis if I've ever heard one, right? The fact is, feeling like God is distant and uninterested is a part of our Bible, and it can't be easily ignored. Those feelings of distance from God, though, they're never judged, they're never shamed or criticized by God. And Jesus himself expressed these kinds of emotions on the cross when he directly quoted Psalm 22. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's the next slide. Can you put that one up? Matthew 27:46, he says that. He's directly quoting Psalm 22. So let's talk about Lazarus. The context is very helpful in this story. It helps us to understand the emotions in a deeper way. So in this story, word was sent from Mary and Martha to Jesus that Lazarus was sick. Now, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, they come from a wealthy family. Jesus would often stay at their home when he was ministering in Jerusalem because it was only 2 miles every morning, which was here in the scripture. And he was invited to stay with them regularly. Jesus would have a little commute in the morning, a little commute in the evening, but a nice place to stay away from the city. And add to this, Jesus and Lazarus were close friends. Lazarus is specifically referenced as Jesus' friend. And in verse 3, it says, "The one whom you love is sick." It didn't even say Lazarus. Mary and Martha are thinking Jesus is going to drop whatever he's doing and come to us so he can save Lazarus. But when he heard that they needed him, he stayed where he was for 2 full days. So how do you not feel let down in a moment like that? You know the one who has the power to save is 2 miles down the road, but he stayed there for 2 more days. So imagine with me the messenger coming back empty-handed. You know, Mary and Martha see the messenger coming back. They probably asked him, "Where's Jesus?" And he said that if you believe, you'll see God's glory. What does that mean to them? I imagine they felt very confused and betrayed. So I have a few points that I want to share here. The first one is give yourself permission to be honest. We see lots of honesty from Mary and Martha to Jesus in this story. Martha says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And in verse 32, it says, "When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.'" So when you're going through a trial, allow yourself to be honest with God like they were. Like the author of Psalm 88, give yourself the permission to communicate plainly your pain, your anger. We're so conditioned to keep these things bottled. You know, we ask, what if people think we're questioning our faith? What if they start wondering if I really believe? And I'd like to say to you, God can handle your questions. He can handle your questions of faith. You can be doing all the right things and still go through a trial like this that makes you question everything. And it doesn't mean that you're not in God's will. And I'd like to say, actually, that's where real faith is born, in those places. So give yourself permission. Secondly, recognize that God feels your pain with you. I love this part of the story. And I love the way that Jesus responds to Mary. It says in verse 33, "When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. 'Where have you laid him?' he asked. 'Come and see,' they replied." And then verse 35, Jesus wept. Verse 35 has a reputation for being the shortest verse in the Bible. And I always just thought, oh, that's funny. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept, until, several years ago when I realized the importance of that. That is not an accident that those 2 words are one verse. It's because the God of the universe in human form is weeping over his friends. Like, think about that. That is powerful. And I'd like to say that still happens today with your situations. I think that God is that connected to us. And even when we can't feel it, I hope that this story can give us hope that God responds to us in the same way. He sees our pain. He sees even our feelings of betrayal, our feelings of, God, why didn't you come through for me? He sees those feelings, and he understands, and he weeps with you. Hebrews says that we don't have a high priest that can't empathize with us. So not only does our pain move him, but he even cares about the object of our pain. Think about that. He was moved by Mary's emotions, but he also was moved by the same thing that Mary was moved by. He cared about the thing that Mary cared about, and he cares about the thing that you care about. And I think that if we could just grasp that for real, like if I could understand, it would give me such peace in my moments, in my dark moments, in my trials. And here's the last thing. I'm trying to end on a positive note here. Let your faith grow through the pain, through situations like this. Faith is born in moments like these, when all hope is lost and nothing good can be seen. Jesus came through for Lazarus. Lazarus was raised. If life was a smoothly paved road with no curves, imagine for a second, no curves, smoothly paved, easy to drive on, we wouldn't really need faith to make it. We would just drive straight with certainty that the road will never curve. But life is often a gravel road with giant potholes and broken bridges, especially in Illinois. Certainty won't get you through. It won't. Certainty won't get you through in this life. And I think that actually certainty needs to die in order for true faith to be born. Like the author of Psalm 88, even though we feel rejected or abandoned, day and night we still call out to him. And like Martha in this story, if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Her faith was still there. The sliver of hope, that sliver of hope is that faith that holds on when we're surrounded by darkness. Now, by raising Lazarus, like we said, Jesus was pointing to the ultimate promise of his resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. So I think sometimes we hear stories like this and people, if I'm being honest, sometimes our experience is not about seeing. What is faith about? In the resurrection life, don't do it alone. And I think this is really important. Times in life can be shared. And it should be a place where regardless of the outcome of our circumstances, we encourage each other to keep holding on to faith. And there are times, isn't it? And that's why we don't want to do it, because it's exhausting. But I think reality has to be addressed here. We have to be honest with ourselves. We can contend and we can pray and we can believe that God will come through for us like he did for Lazarus. And when he doesn't, even though they die, the resurrection life of Jesus is still present. It's still there. Because our hope isn't in the miracle. Our hope is in the one who provided it. Our hope is in the resurrection life. It's not in the sign. The sign points to the real miracle, which is the resurrection life. So today, in this week, and with whatever you're going through, I want you to consider that. Faith isn't dependent on the outcome of your circumstance. Faith is tested by the outcome of your circumstance often, but it isn't dependent on it. It shouldn't be dependent on it. And either way, our faith will be strengthened. So, my speech teacher always told me to say, never end your speech with, well, that's all I got. But he would be very, very disappointed in me right now. So, if you'll stand with me, I'm going to say a prayer for us. And then after that, if you have the time, please stay and help us set up the sanctuary for Thanksgiving dinner. Yeah, I have a chart, so I will kind of direct. First of all the chairs go. We'll get to that. I'm going to pray first. Okay, here we go. Dear Lord, I thank you for your word, and I thank you for this story. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us in our situations, Lord, to reach for the resurrection life. No matter the outcome of our circumstances, Lord, that our faith could be strengthened either way, Lord. Tested, maybe, yes. And sometimes there's just celebration because you come through and it's a miracle. Either way, Lord, I pray that you would give us the strength to trust in your resurrection life, not to look for the sign necessarily, but to just believe that you are the one, Lord, that we're looking for. You're the one with the resurrection life. I pray that you would that phrase, just help us to understand it more. Lord, what does it mean for us to live in that resurrection life today, in our daily life? And I pray for each and every person's circumstance, whatever they're going through, that they would keep their faith,